Was Tommy's prison escape taken from real life? Why is tuna used as a currency in prison? Why has Faisal's personality changed so much? Will Rob report what he found in the suitcase? Keep watching to find out the answers to these questions. Welcome to Square Eyes, a channel where we recap, review and take a sideways look at your favourite TV shows. This video will take a look at the 4th episode of Series 3 of Happy Valley. The BBC iPlayer summarises this episode by saying, as Tommy's big day approaches, Catherine becomes suspicious and Ryan finds a new way to defy her. I'll tell you more in my full recap. Let's jump straight in. The episode starts with Ivan and Matea in their car, straight after the final scene of the last episode, where the police had arrested Josep just before they'd got to his house to murder him. This piece of poor timing means they're now in big trouble with their bosses and are in a bit of a flap. They're even more worried because they've got a backpack full of cash that he shouldn't have. Josep took it out of the flat the police raided. Rather than hand it over to Victor, their boss, they kept it for themselves, and now they need to hide it or risk their bosses knowing that they stole it from them. Catherine catches up with Anne Gallagher about her CID attachment, and it's clear from their conversation that Anne isn't doing very well. She's become overly attached to the case that she's working on, and is incensed that Josep won't be charged with the more serious charges that are harder to prove, and instead they are pursuing softer but easier to prove crimes, despite the fact that he effectively held a blind woman captive, who then fell to her death because of his actions. Anne's level of anger and animation suggests she's lost all of her objectivity. Even worse, she hasn't followed up on the number plate that Catherine gave her for Ivan and Matea's car, after they were spotted lurking around the house Josep was caught outside. There's a casualness and sloppiness to the way that Anne is behaving that seems so out of character that she seems to be completely unable to do her job effectively. It could be that she's struggling with the long-term effects of post-traumatic stress syndrome, or it's even possible that she's been drinking on the job. Either could explain her erratic behaviour. Ivan and Matea take the backpack full of cash down to the allotment to bury it, but before they get there they get a call from Victor to say that Darius wants to talk to them and he will be along to collect them in a couple of hours. The boys are understandably very worried about this news. They head off to bury the money quickly before their meeting. Incidentally, we've seen these allotments before because Catherine's sister Claire has a plot on these allotments, which might just be a coincidence, but I have a suspicion that this will be relevant in a later episode. Rob arrives home from work and we expect him to find Joe's body in the kitchen, and there's even some clever camera work to make it look like the little girl in the coat, Poppy, has discovered the body, but everything seems normal apart from Joe not being in the house. Next we see Catherine confront Neil in his shop, and we find out that there are details about what Tommy Lee Royce did to Catherine's daughter Becky that only her and Richard know. Neil defends his decision to take Ryan to the prison to see his dad, but doesn't really make a very convincing argument, saying that he was going to find a way to go anyway. But this isn't really true, as he would have needed an adult chaperone to take him. It still feels like there's another factor in Neil's involvement in taking Ryan to see Tommy that we don't yet know about, but this conversation doesn't really give any extra clues. Catherine did manage to get Neil to promise to stop taking Ryan to prison, and in the process found out that Tommy had invited Ryan to come see his sentencing hearing in Leeds. Catherine is confused about why Tommy would want Ryan to be there, and it sets off her detective instincts, even though Neil doesn't see anything particularly strange about it. Then we get a makeover sequence as Tommy Lee Royce gets ready for his court appearance. His long hair and beard are out, and a clean-shaven, well-groomed look is in. The actor who plays Tommy is an unquestionably handsome man, so I can understand the lingering shots during this montage, but it also feels a little bit gratuitous. One shot that was quite interesting during this section was the close-up on Royce's Ryan tattoo. Does this point towards him having genuine feelings towards his son, rather than just using him as a pawn in the game to get revenge on Catherine? Richard, for reasons that aren't explained, is working in Catherine's kitchen as he continues to research the Knezovich's criminal activities. Catherine is still confused about why Tommy Lee Royce wants Ryan to go to see him in court, and Alison Gars is now helping Catherine with her project to fix her battered-up Land Rover, so she can drive it to the Himalayas when she retires, presuming nothing tragic happens to her between now and her retirement. There's a funny exchange between Richard and Catherine, where Richard is clearly scared of Alison because she shot and killed her son, but Catherine has clearly got a connection with her, possibly because they're both the survivors of traumatic incidents in the past. Then Richard shares some of his research on the Knezovich brothers, which feels like a bit of a refresher for anyone who might have forgotten about them. Then we finally get to meet the Knezoviches as they confront Ivan and Matea about letting Josep get caught by the police in the last episode. There's an awkward conversation about the warehouse Darius has just bought, which is cut short when he gives Ivan a beating. He also relieves himself on his underling, which seems excessive and uncalled for, but I suppose he knows more about how to motivate henchmen than I do. The beating is doubly cruel, as Ivan is due to get married in a couple of days, and Darius's blows now mean that the underling will now have marks all over his face for his wedding photos. After Matea helps Ivan up, Darius tells them both about a job he has for them the next day in Leeds, which must be related to Tommy's court date. The next morning, Neil, Claire and Ryan are gathered around the table for an awkward chat. Neil is trying to explain to Ryan that he won't be taking him to prison anymore without upsetting Ryan. Claire is unbelievably weak and spineless in this scene, unable to be assertive and scared of saying anything that might be unpopular with Ryan. Over in the Hepworth household, Rob is getting used to Joe not being around as he gets his mum to help out with the childcare. He seems to think she's walked out on him, which is a fair assumption after the way he's treated her, rather than her being murdered by the pharmacist which she's been sleeping with in exchange for painkillers. As he's setting off for the school run, Rob is distracted by Poppy in the back seat and doesn't see Faisal pull out in front of him. Then there's a low-speed collision as Rob drives into the back of Faisal's car as they are about to go through some temporary traffic lights. The two men have a confrontation of sorts, with Rob getting angry and flustered, while Faisal stays calm and reasonable. Despite the provocation, Faisal seems cool as a cucumber, and if anything, almost seems to enjoy Rob's frustration. When Faisal is trying to calm Rob down, he asks him if anything else is upsetting him, which I suspect was the whole point of him causing the crash in the first place. He wanted to have an interaction with Rob to see what was going on with him. And it was sort of clever, as Faisal now knows that Rob definitely doesn't know that Faisal was the one supplying Joanna with pills, as there's no way he wouldn't have mentioned it during this confrontation. Similarly, he also knows that Rob doesn't know about his wife's death, judging from the emotional state, as he's just his usual angry self. I've been quite scathing of Faisal in past videos, but here I think he's finally showing some intelligence and cunning. Catherine goes to see her boss, Mike Taylor, to tell him about her suspicion that Tommy Lee Royce is going to try and escape from prison. Mike is sceptical when he hears that Catherine's evidence is based upon him inviting Ryan to see him in court and then talking about a future ambition to go bungee jumping. But like us viewers, I think he knows that Catherine's intuition is rarely wrong and agrees to make a phone call. Catherine is then pulled away to take her own phone call. It's Rob Hepworth, and with his usual lack of charm or grace, he accuses Catherine of putting his wife Joanna in a women's refuge, which is a tricky thing to say to a police officer, without also admitting that you're a wife-beater, but he seems happy enough to ask the question. Catherine is concerned when Rob tells her that Joe's gone missing. He tries to reassure her that she's not missing, he just doesn't know where she is, which obviously doesn't do anything to settle Catherine's twitching instincts. Catherine asks Rob to ring around the local hospitals and then report her missing, but he refuses. At Leeds train station, Ryan spots that his granddad has caught the same train as him to go watch the court case. For an investigative journalist, Richard's observation skills don't seem to be the best, as he hasn't noticed his grandson, despite catching the same train as him. I've been to Hebden Bridge Station before, and it would be really hard not to notice a family member on the same platform as you. Joe Hepworth's mother and father come into the police station to report her missing. Luckily, Joyce on the front desk recognises the name and diverts them to Catherine, so she can talk to them. We find out from the discussion that Rob was actually Joe's teacher when they first met, and they got together when she was very young. He has since become incredibly controlling, and Joe's parents suspect Rob might have done something to Joe. In a more light-hearted moment, Joyce goes to Mike Taylor for guidance on what to do about Catherine's leaving do and whip round. She's raised over £2,000 for her, and plenty of people wanted to contribute, including people she's previously arrested. After Catherine had previously made it clear she doesn't want a leaving do, Joyce doesn't know whether to ignore her wishes and plan one anyway, or whether to have a more low-key send-off for her. No decision is made, but I think we were just shown this scene to remind us that Catherine doesn't have long left, and that there'll be some sort of send-off in the next couple of episodes. The light relief doesn't last long, as Catherine interrupts to ask Mike Taylor for permission to report Joe Hepworth as a missing person, due to the concerning reports from her parents, coupled with a discussion with Rob and Catherine's own tingling spider senses. Mike Taylor is reluctant to report her missing when she's not been gone all that long, but, as I mentioned earlier, he's also well aware of Catherine's impressive instincts. Tommy finally gets his day in court, and he's delighted when he sees Ryan in the public gallery. Ryan looks nervous as he's trying to keep away from his granddad, who's still oblivious to his presence despite them sitting on the same row as each other. While Tommy's inside the courtroom, we see Mattia and Ivan are sat outside, looking on edge and unhappy. When we first met them in Faisal's pharmacy in the first episode, they seemed so menacing, but ever since they just seem to be bouncing from one bad situation to the next. Rob Hepworth has a meeting with a missing persons detective, who investigates the house, looking for clues about Joanna's whereabouts. While he doesn't make any direct accusations, it's pretty clear that he's suspicious of Rob, which is pretty reasonable even if we know that Rob is innocent. The final place the detective wants to see is the garage, which Rob happily shows him. As they are looking around, Rob does a double take when he sees a suitcase, but he doesn't mention it to the detective. Instead, he says everything is as it should be and sends the detective on his way. Once he's gone, Rob returns to the garage and checks the suitcase, which is unusually heavy. When he looks inside, he finds Joe's folded-up body. Back in the courtroom, Ivan and Mattea cause chaos by starting a fight with two other guys in the corridor, which draws security out to deal with it. This provides a distraction for Tommy Lee Royce to make his escape attempt. He beats up the two security guards nearest to him and climbs out of the glass box he's been held inside before running out of the court. He makes it out of the courthouse before the doors are locked down and sprints through the streets of Leeds until he hides inside Rico's newsagents, which had been referenced in his tiny mobile back in episode 2. Richard finally notices Ryan and expresses his disappointment at him going along to the court hearing before agreeing to take him home. Meanwhile, Tommy has changed into full cycling gear and picked up a road bike from Rico's, so he has a great disguise to evade the police as they search the city for him. The episode ends with Royce cycling away to freedom, leaving us wondering what he'll do next and having to wait until the next episode to find out. I enjoyed this episode, just like all the others in this season, but I don't think it was my favourite. The best bits of this episode relied more on action set pieces and crime drama, whereas the other episodes focused more on the emotional scenes between characters we've grown to love over several seasons. Happy Valley has always felt like a strange mix of gangster films and kitchen sink dramas, and this episode felt a lot more Quentin Tarantino than Alan Bennett. In the last episode, we had the wonderful coffee shop scene between Claire and Catherine, which was captivating to watch, but in this episode there weren't any equivalent moments. It was more about pushing along the complex plot and keeping the action moving. The prison break was also a little far-fetched. I'll talk about this later, but I felt myself having to suspend disbelief during those scenes, which shouldn't have to happen. Even though I'm glad Tommy is now on the loose, as it makes the story more interesting, the way he did it relied on a lot of fairly unlikely events taking place all at the same time. But I suppose you could say that about most stories too. Nobody walked out of Toy Story because the idea of talking toys was completely unrealistic. The story's getting fairly complicated now, with just 2 episodes to go, so to make things simple I'm going to go through each of the major characters and go over where they are after this week's episode. Catherine is now only 2 days away from retirement. She still hasn't patched things up with Ryan and Claire after falling out with them about the prison visits. She has pushed for Joe's missing persons investigation to go ahead, and she was the only one that saw Tommy's prison escape coming before it happened. Ryan is still staying with Claire and Neil, though they have now told him, in their own mild-mannered way, that they won't take him to the prison visits anymore. He witnessed his dad escape from prison, and his granddad took him home from the court. Claire and Neil are both in Catherine's bad books, and are trying to patch it up with her. Rob Hepworth has now found Joe's body in the suitcase, but hasn't yet reported it to the police. He really should have pointed the suitcase out to the detective the second he saw it in the garage. The fact he didn't suggests he's scared he'll be the prime suspect in a murder investigation, and is reluctant to involve the law at this stage. Will he avoid informing the police of her death because he thinks his domestic violence towards Joe in the past will make him the prime suspect? Faisal seemed to have been completely transformed in the short amount of time we spent with him in this episode. After being a nervous wreck prior to killing Joe, murder seems to have brought out a new, more assertive, confident side to him. You don't see self-improvement courses recommending killing people, but he does seem to have worked wonders for the pharmacist. He got the better of Rob when they clashed after the car crash, and it seemed like he did a decent job of cleaning up the crime scene after murdering Joe. However, I have a feeling he's not covered his tracks completely. Firstly, the blister pack for the pills the police took from Joe linked Faisal's pharmacy to her. Secondly, he touched the door handle on the way into Joe's house before he put his gloves on the day he killed Joe. And thirdly, the camera lingered on a piece of clothing in the bedroom. Could he have left something in there? Surely not, but that was the suggestion. Richard's investigation into the Knezoviches doesn't seem to be progressing much, as the majority of his work seems to be either reading other people's newspaper reports or listening to things that Catherine has told him. He still feels like he's in quite a lot of danger, though, as the second he publishes a story critical of the criminal network, he'll have a target on his back. It also feels like the story could do with the death of a major character to raise the stakes at this point. So if I was Richard, I would be making sure my life insurance was up to date pretty quickly. Ivan and Matea had a tough episode this week. I've never worked in a criminal gang, but I've been in meetings with bosses after projects that have gone badly wrong, and they've had a similar mood to the one that they had with Darius Knezovich. We call them lessons learned meetings. I think the lesson Ivan will have learned will be to wear a waterproof Mac the next time he goes for a meeting with his boss. I mentioned earlier that things have been tough for this pair lately, but with Ivan's wedding in the next episode, we can only hope that better times are around the corner. Anne Gallagher has her dream job in CID, but seems to be throwing it away because of the ongoing scars left from her experience at the hands of Tommy Lee Royce in Season 1. Could there be an opportunity for her to get some revenge, and maybe even closure before the end of the series? Tommy was obviously the star of this episode, with his elaborate escape from the courthouse. He hasn't had a lot of screen time in this season until now, but in every episode there have been little nods towards his impending freedom, but never enough detail to really tell us how he was going to get out. Now we know, we can look forward to seeing what we will do next now he's out of jail. Most convicts who escape prison only care about not getting caught, but with Royce he will surely be coming for Catherine and Ryan. My favourite line from this episode was Faisal's when he said, "Stay in the car, ladies," after he had his car accident with Rob Hepworth. I thought it was really funny and out of character for him to say this, as it's the sort of thing a more confident macho man would say. His daughters thought the same, and they giggled at him for saying this. I think the reason he was talking like this was also part of his new persona that he's adopting after killing Joe. After years of being a doormat, it seems that he's now trying to be a more dominant person. It'll be interesting to see how this develops over the rest of the season. Will he be able to keep it up as the pressure increases on him? For example, if the police question him, or if the gangsters come back and ask for more money. One of the little details I really liked in this episode was how Darius Knezovich cleaned his hands with a wet wipe once he'd finished with Ivan. We know that Darius is mostly a legitimate businessman these days. so there was a visual reminder he likes to keep his hands clean, even if he does occasionally do a little bit of dirty work. The scene where Tommy Lee Royce escaped out of the courtroom seemed a little far-fetched, but when I looked into it, prisoners escaping happens fairly regularly. An article in the Daily Star a couple of years ago said that over 500 people had escaped from UK prisons in the previous 5 years, some of them being serious and violent offenders. In fact, Tommy's story closely mirrors one featured in the Manchester Evening News a couple of years ago of a Nicholas Bunclark, who received a 16-month sentence for actual bodily harm, and instead of going to prison, escaped from Liverpool Crown Court courtroom and walked out of the building. He then caught a train to Southport. This real-life story wasn't all that exciting, though. He didn't seek revenge or flee the country. Once he got to Southport, he didn't know what to do, so he turned himself into the police and ended up with an extra 4 months on his sentence. The guy cutting Tommy Lee Royce's hair in the prison cell isn't an actor. He's a barber called Gaz from Cutthroat Barbers in Manchester. Rather than film specific shots, the whole 40-minute haircut and shave was filmed. James Norton, the actor who plays Tommy Lee Royce, said that it created a weird meditative state in him. I found it interesting that the haircut cost 3 tins of tuna, with an additional tin of tuna paid as a tip. Apparently tuna is a fairly common currency in prisons, as well as cigarettes. More health-conscious prisoners find tuna a good source of protein, which is useful if you're trying to build muscle while you're inside, which in turn is handy if you're planning on beating up some guards before you escape from a courtroom. In my last video, I highlighted the kindness wall sign in the Hepworth household. In this week's episode, there are even more similar artworks on display as Rob prowled around his property. By the door in the hallway, there's a little statue that says calm. On the windowsill in the bedroom, there's a similar one with the word love. And on the kitchen notice board, there's a little sign that reads, "Love you to the moon and back." There's another love statue on the drawers in the bedroom too. It feels like there's such a lack of these emotions in the household that Joe's brought these items into the home in place of them. We've got just 2 episodes left in the series, and there feels to be a lot of story still to get through before we can reach a satisfying conclusion. I feel like these last couple of hours are going to have a frantic pace to get through all the various story threads that still need tying up. Here are some of the questions I hope we get answers to in the next episode. Will Tommy Lee Royce go straight for Catherine? How will Ryan react to seeing his father escape? Will he be impressed or will he be disgusted? Will Rob tell the police about Joe's death now he's found her body? Can Faisal sustain his newfound confidence now he's a killer? Will Anne Gallagher pull it together and thrive in her new job, or will she throw her chance in CID away because she's haunted by the demons of her past? Will Richard's investigation into the Knezoviches get him into trouble? And, most importantly to me, will Ivan's much talked about wedding go ahead without a hitch? I hope you've enjoyed watching my recap and review of episode 4 of season 3 of Happy Valley. I'll be posting my video for episode 5 in a few days' time. Please make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications to make sure you don't miss it. Thank you. Goodbye.